I on? Yes. Okay. I don't think so. It's not on mute. I've turned it. Okay. Yeah, now I'm getting it. I wasn't getting feedback. Well, it's great to be here. Most of you are here, and I don't think anybody, and least of all myself, could have anticipated another program today. This date was random when I first set it up, but this church will stand in my memory for a long time because I've had a lot of guilt feelings about different appointments and whether I'd missed them or what week they were, but this one I came a month early. Some of you might remember I took a little promotion between church and Sabbath school, and then I drove like crazy and arrived at my other appointment for the afternoon meeting. But in the meantime, the pastor had to give the 2 services in the morning. So I don't know if they'll ever forgive me, but it's certainly good to be here. And the introduction now took a good opportunity to remind you of a practical part of our religious liberty work. Please keep that in mind. And in funding the department during the annual promotion, of course, you are helping defend yourself, but also you are funding Liberty magazine, which goes mostly to non-Adventists. I'm proud of it per se, but it's nothing that I've done or even my predecessors. But the way things have devolved, at the moment, Liberty magazine is our largest outreach magazine. Other things have declined a bit, Signs and Sentinella, they're relatively small. We're still sending out very close to 200,000 copies every issue of Liberty, and all but about 10,000 go to what we call the thought leaders. I wish the thought leaders, we could say, are our own members, but the legislators at the state and federal level, the mayors, the lawyers, we want these people to know biblical principles of religious freedom and remind them of their constitutional underpinnings in this country. It's not true in every country. So we have a great privilege when we talk religious liberty here. We're also boosting the principles of our country. I was looking at the program this morning, and I did confuse the pastor a bit. He asked me for a title for my Sabbath school talk, and I gave him that, and I see that's printed as my sermon title. And I've been an editor and even a proofreader for many, many years, and mistakes get through. You can stare at them even on the front cover, and you'll look at a word and it comes out wrong. But this tickled my fancy because it says, "Your redemption draweth nigh." Well, my name is Steed, Lincoln Steed, the horse's neigh. But I'm sure it was meant to be nigh, coming close. But that isn't the title of the sermon. I want to do what my wife criticizes me for. When I read too much, she gets on my case. But I want to share something with you this morning that involves a bit of reading. And in Sabbath school, I indulged myself in thinking back to what my father had said. But I'll go further back than his death and remembering him in my growing years. When I was very young, growing up in Australia, for a few years before my father moved to the division headquarters in Wahroonga, Australia, when I was about 8. But before that, I attended public school. And I don't even imagine to know what public school was like in the United States at that time. But I can tell you in Australia back then, when as a 5-year-old I went to school, it was like Charles Dickens. The schools were segregated. I remember in 3rd grade moving up from the little junior classes into the boys' school, and it was in a big, large brick building, a little bit like a Harry Potter set. And the masters sat up on a high platform, and they would ask questions of all the little fearful boys arranged there. And if you didn't know the question, you disappeared. I don't know where they went. They left that school. They were back to the lower grades. But what I really remember, with actually some fondness, other than the first day, it was the first day my mother took me a couple of miles. She didn't have a car. My father was at work. He had the only car in our home. And she walked with me a couple of miles down our long street, through the little town nearby, under a railway underpass, through a little town, over another railway bridge at a train station, a little bit more walking, and then we arrived at the school. And I remember lots of crying that first day. All the kids were clinging to their mothers, and they dragged them away. They weren't so concerned about happiness for the kids back then. But from that day on, I walked. And at first it was strange, but after a while it was a great adventure. And I can remember paddling in the drainage ditches under the railway line and being amazed at all the little worms and stuff growing out of the mud. I'm sure if my parents had known, they'd have been horrified, because that was diphtheria time and territory. And I can remember paddling through the water. And I remember one day my mother gave me a pair of brand new shoes, and I came back barefoot. And without any good explanation for her as to where my shoes were. Of course, I couldn't tell her about wading in the water. I remember putting the pennies on the railway line and having them flattened, and all of these adventures on the way to school, climbing up trees near the town, near the train station, and remembering all the housewives out shopping, being horrified, a little boy up in the treetop. But what really stuck in my mind was on the main road there near our house, further down, maybe half a mile away, there was an empty block, overgrown, dust and holes and everything there. And we used to play marbles there a lot. You know, you smooth a bit of the dust out, make a scribed circle, and put the group's marbles in the middle. And if you had ball bearings marbles, you were a winner, because the game was you got on the outside and you took a shot. Anything you could knock out of the circle, you got to keep. And ball bearings didn't bounce out too easy. So I remembered that block very well from that. But I will never, ever forget, one day, probably in the summer, but Australia's pretty warm, at least that part of Australia. Summer, winter doesn't matter much. But one day, a beautiful warm day, I'm walking home and I came past that block, and instead of the overgrown grass and the marble playground, here there's a big tent, sort of like a circus tent. And out front was a big sign, actually two signs, hand-painted, very large, like circus billboards. And one of them had a picture of a knight in armour, with the sword at the ready, a medieval knight with the metal armour and ready for battle. And the other one had a man from the Middle Ages with a burden on his back, trudging wearily along. And then there was like a circus barker out front, calling to all the little boys and girls that were walking home from school, come on in, come on in. We're going to tell you a story every day after school, a story of battles and wars and victories and giants. And man, it was amazing stuff. It was a long time ago. I won't tell you how long. In fact, I was very interested in Adventist longevity this morning. We have certain advantages to being Christians. As you know, the Old Testament, the 40 years in the wilderness, people's shoes didn't even wear out. God can bless you a little bit. But I don't know about you, I'm hoping for the blessing of eternal life, not just 6 or 7 years longer. But as a little tip, if you want to live a bit longer, go to Australia. I looked up, it just prompted me. And the US is 43rd on the list of longevity in world nations. Australia's 13, so... But there's a bit more going on than just how long you live. It's infant mortality and diseases and so on, and medical system. But we all want to live forever, obviously. But this changed my life to go to this program. There's no question. And I remember after school looking forward to getting the next installment on this wild story. And back then, this is what I was in the process of telling you. Back then, I'm sure as here, we weren't as fixated on television narratives, and the media really just wasn't there. It was the newspaper and other things that I think back on, and I think, what sort of a life was I living? It was a big city of 4 million even back then in Australia, but I can remember the horse-drawn bread carts coming around. I can remember the fuller brush men. I can remember the men carrying long wooden poles that they'd cut from the wood, selling them as clothes props. An interesting era. So that sort of entertainment was very attractive. And I went every day that I could. And I remember one very important day. I had a dental appointment, but even now, I'd do anything to avoid a dental appointment. So I went along to the program. I'm sitting there rapt, listening to the story, and my parents, who I didn't even know were aware of my attending this, they come along and pull me out of the program to go to the dentist. The story they were telling was a story written by John Bunyan back in the 1600s, Pilgrim's Progress. If you know anything about Adventism and Protestantism and early Christianity in this country, you'll know that by the mid-1800s, when our church began, there were a certain small number of books that everybody had. Of course, you had to have the Bible, King James Version. You had to have Fox's Book of Martyrs. You had to have John Milton's Paradise Lost. And you had to have John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. They were obligatory for all Protestant Christians. Recently, with Liberty Magazine, I reached back to that memory, and in fact, this is our January issue, and pulled one of the pictures from a very early edition of Pilgrim's Progress. And there's that knight, not standing up so proud, back crouching in the corner with his shield up, fending off a lion-headed beast with fiery darts and quite a fearsome mane. That's from Pilgrim's Progress. That's the battle that John Bunyan was talking about, and it was the battle that each of us really are involved with. That was his genius, a book that, other than John Milton and William Shakespeare, John Bunyan is the most well-recognized and acknowledged writer in the English language. The book is constantly in print because he speaks of every man, Christian, pilgrim, leaving the city of destruction, as you and I figuratively and some literally have had to have done, and we're all battling our way day by day along the King's Highway to the celestial city. And if we think that it's a journey that's going to be accomplished without a battle, we're kidding ourselves. The text or the sequence of text that really introduces this, I think, of what I want to share, is found in Ephesians 6:11-20. I want to go over it with you again. We know it all very well, but think about it this way. Paul says, "We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." And he says, put on the whole armor of God so you can stand. And he says, "Wherefore, take unto you the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day. Stand therefore, having your loins girt with truth," the belt of truth, "breastplate of righteousness, above all taking the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God." I love that terminology, even though I'm a pacifist. I've got to tell you, in my life, Vietnam is a horrible rear-view memory. And it was a wonderful reality that my grades were good and my number was high and I never went there. But I don't believe in war. It doesn't settle anything. But when you're talking about a spiritual journey and the necessary battles against the world, the flesh and the devil, of course it's conflict. I don't think anyone is going to passively make their way on a litter or a palanquin to that city. I want to share with you a little element of Pilgrim's Progress. So maybe those that haven't read it might want to read. It's in the language very close to the King James Bible, which today people have a little trouble with, and I can't blame them. We don't speak that way anymore. Although I think when we're reading the Bible, well, there's nothing particularly sacred about the translation of the King James Version. It's still a pretty well thought out and articulately presented version. I personally like the Revised Standard Version about as much. I'm not keen on NIV or dog patch versions or whatever. You can find truth in all of them. But I think language is important, and if it's well constructed, it increases the power of it. And to me, Pilgrim's Progress is good if you read it correctly. And I hope I can. I want to share the battle between pilgrim or Christian and that fiend that's in that illustration that you might or may not have been able to make out on the cover. He met him in the Valley of Humiliation. Now, John Bunyan's been accused of writing, by people that don't understand literature anyhow, fiction. I don't think it classically is. What he says it is a similitude or the model of a dream. But it's very plain. He's talking figuratively about the journey, spiritual journey, from turning our back on the things of this world and remaining faithful through death and receiving the promise, finally, of a kingdom, an eternal kingdom. But in the Valley of Humiliation, and I'm going to read now, it says, poor Christian was hard put, for he had gone but a little way before he espied a foul fiend coming over the field to meet him. His name is Apollyon. Then did Christian begin to be afraid and to cast his mind back to whether he should go back or stand his ground. But he considered that he had no armour for his back, and therefore he thought that to turn the back to him might give him greater advantage, to pierce him with darts. And when Apollyon came up, he said, whence come you, and whither are you bound? Christian said, I'm come from the city of destruction, which is the place of all evil, and I'm going to the city of Zion. By this, says Apollyon, I perceive you are one of my subjects, for all that country is mine, and I am the prince and God of it. How is it then that thou hast run away from thy king? Maybe I should tell you the context of Pilgrim's Progress before I go further. I alluded to it in Sabbath school. 100 years before the American War of Independence, political dispute in England. It was pretty severe, and as I thought about it, not so dissimilar to today. There were a lot of religionists abroad in the land. The Reformation was still being fought over. The Puritans were rising in influence and godly self-confidence. And the King of England was very autocratic, didn't care much for Parliament, but because of a dispute with the church in Scotland over who would appoint bishops, he called Parliament to get some money to go to war, and they started sassing him. And there was a classic day when the king, determined to deal with Parliament, took his personal guard and marched into Parliament, determined to arrest the Speaker of the House. And he comes in the front door, and the Speaker ran out the back. And the king says, oh, I see the birds have flown. So he dismissed Parliament, and they went out the back door to another room and decided to form up an army and fight the king. And so began the Civil War, which ended up being the Puritans against the Catholic-influenced forces of the king. Puritans won, installed their general as after they killed the king, cut his head off, and installed their general as a religious dictator, a Puritan dictator in England. This is only 100 years before the United States War of Independence. John Bunyan was a soldier in that army, but at the time of the Civil War he was not converted. It was only in the years following that he discovered true religion and became an itinerant preacher. So the issue of king was pretty loaded in that time. The kings till that point, and some of them today, said that they ruled by divine order, and that to challenge the king was to challenge God. And so when the Puritans condemned the king in law, and then forced him to kneel down and bow his head and cut it off, for some people this was an attack on God. And John Bunyan, I'm sure, was putting that in. He says, so back again, this is still the beginning of the conflict. He says, by this I perceive thou art one of my subjects. For all that country is mine, and I am the prince and God of it. How is it then that thou hast run away from thy king? Were it not that I hope that thou mayest do me more service, I would strike thee now at one blow to the ground. I was indeed born in your kingdom, says Christian, but your service was hard, and your wages such as a man could not live on. For the wages of sin is death. Therefore, when I was come to years, I did as others would do. I look out if I could mend myself. There is no prince, says Apollyon, that will lightly lose his subjects. neither will I as yet lose thee. But since thou complainest of thy service and wages, be content to go back. And what our country will afford thee, I do here promise to give thee. But I have let myself to another, says Christian, even to the King of Kings. And how can I with fairness go back with thee? Thou hast done in this, says Apollyon, according to the proverb, changed a bad thing for a worse. But it is common for those that have called themselves his servants, after a while, to give him the slip and return again to me. Do thou this too, and all shall be well. I have given him my faith, said Christian, and sworn my service to him. How then can I go back from this and not be hanged as a traitor? Thou didst the same to me, and yet I am willing to pass by all, if now thou wilt yet turn again and go back. What I promised thee, says Christian, was in my youth. And besides, I count that the prince under whose banner I now stand is able to set me free. Yea, and to pardon also what I did in my service with thee. And besides, destroying Apollyon, to speak the truth, I like his service, his wages, his servants, his government, his company, better than thine. Therefore, leave off to persuade me further. I am his servant, and I will follow him. Then Apollyon broke into a grievous rage, saying, I am an enemy to this prince. I hate his person, his laws and people. I am come out on purpose to withstand thee. Apollyon, says Christian, beware what you do, for I am in the king's highway, the way of holiness. Therefore, take heed to thyself. Then Apollyon straddled over the whole breadth of the way and said, I am void of fear in this matter. Prepare thyself to die, for I swear by my infernal den that thou shalt go no further. Here I will spill thy soul. With that he flew a flaming dart at his breast, but Christian held a shield in his hand. Remember what these weapons are. Held a shield in his hand with which he caught and so prevented the danger of that. Then did Christian draw, for he saw it was time to bestir him. And Apollyon as fast made at him, throwing darts as thick as hail at him. Notwithstanding all that Christian could do to avoid it, Apollyon wounded him in his head, hand, and foot. This made Christian give a little back. Apollyon therefore followed his work, and Christian again took courage and resisted as manfully as he could. This combat lasted above half a day, even till Christian was almost quite spent. For you must know that Christian, by means of his wounds, must grow needs weaker and weaker. Then Apollyon, espying his opportunity, began to gather up close to Christian, and wrestling with him, gave him a dreadful fall, and with that Christian's sword flew out of his hand. Then said Apollyon, I am sure of you now. And with that he had almost pressed him to death, so that Christian began to despair of life. But as God would have it, while Apollyon was fetching his last blow, whereby to make a full end of this good man, Christian nimbly reached back his hand for his sword, caught it, saying, Rejoice not against me, O mine enemy. When I fall, I shall arise. And with that gave him a deadly thrust, which made him give back, as one that had received his mortal wound. Christian, perceiving that, made at him again, saying, Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. And with that, Apollyon spread forth his dragon's wings and sped him away, so that Christian for a season saw him no more. I think it's dramatic. It's the battle, if you think about it emotionally, that we all have. Whether it's at night in your dreams thinking about, can I remain faithful? Or are these temptations going to overwhelm me? Or should I remain a Seventh Adventist? Or how can I witness? Or, or worse, you're attracted by something about the city of destruction and the world around us. We're in this battle. As I said, early Adventists and our fellow Protestants, especially in England, treasured this sort of a recounting of their spiritual battle. And I've become more and more convinced that as Seventh-day Adventists, we need to recapture the dynamic that's represented in these writings in those times. I've grown up in the church. I'm a fifth generation Seventh-day Adventist. My family were one of the first that responded when a couple of literature evangelists from the US took a boat to Australia, went straight from the docks out into the countryside, and within weeks had several families that formed a company, and then the church went on. And of course, Ellen White herself went down there later and raised up a college and quite a company of Adventists. Back in those days, Adventism was a holiness church. It's just a matter of history. It was a holiness church that was an outgrowth of many things, as the Reformation can illustrate, as I said earlier this morning. But beyond that, we are in the holiness movement, the movement of the Wesleys, the movement that today is exemplified in a few other churches like the Nazarenes. And if you read Ellen White's writings, the burden is, of course, on present truth, and present truth for the early Adventists was preparing spiritually for that great day of the Lord's appearing. And in between, we're all sorts of battles and challenges. As Jesus said, unless those days be shortened, no flesh will survive. It's not, sort of a drift down the hill. It's not. I'm thinking about skiing now. I'm going to Idaho in a week, and, I'm looking forward to getting on the hill. And gravity takes you. But gravity will not take us to heaven. Gravity will drag us back to the city of destruction. We have to be armed and ready and vigilant, and as Ellen White says, militant. She says we are, with the church, militant. It is not yet triumphant. And that's why Paul was using clearly the figures of his time. Today, if he was writing, he'd probably say, take to shift the air-to-air missile or whatever, or, he'd use modern weaponry. But the Roman soldier and the armor was classic in his time. That's what he was talking about. But, you can't survive by the ways of the world. It has to be spiritual armor. I want to explain a little bit, though, what happened to John Bunyan, because I think it makes this more real. If you're not careful, it's a cardboard cutout of religious activity that at worst can be sort of just works-oriented. It's a battle and a war, and all the fussing and fuming of yesteryear, and even today. It's someone got a screed about what the church should be doing, and someone else, how you can be saved. You do this, and what's the interior view of this text or whatever. And I remember once being startled and then invigorated to hear a now retired president of the North American division get up and speak about what was going on, and he says, I've come to the point, like William Shakespeare, I say, a pox on both their houses. If there's a dispute over doctrinal matters, it's destructive of spirituality by and large. Our battle shouldn't be with each other, it should be with flesh and the devil, and a battle to victory. But let me read something more, and I hope I can read better. The light's bad here, and my eyes are getting worse all the time, and so on. But I hope I can do justice to explaining a little bit to you where John Bunyan was coming from. He wrote many books, not just Pilgrim's Progress. He wrote a fabulous book called The Holy War, where he continued the metaphor into armies battling each other for control of castles and sieges and all the rest, and of course it was about spiritual integrity, and it's quite a good book. He wrote another one about the life and death of Mr. Badman, and that's sort of, those of you that know classical literature, it was very similar to the dialogues of Plato. He had two characters walking and discussing theology. Very good. He also, and I want to quote from it, wrote his biography called Grace Abounding. Actually, it's a bit longer. It's about 3 lines long. But the central thing is grace abounding to him, the chief of sinners. And he tells firsthand how he got where he was. Now, he wrote Pilgrim's Progress in prison, 11 years in prison. And I've often in sermons told his story of his wife following the judge around while he was in prison, imploring the judge to be lenient and let her husband out of jail, and so he could work and feed his children. And the judge turns around and he says, Madam, He says, we will let him out any time he stops preaching. And she says, never. He will never stop preaching. And I read the other day, you know how he supported his kids in prison? He made shoelaces. He couldn't do that today, but he eked out a living. He was an itinerant preacher, a tinker, just a handyman, in other words. But it's wrong to think of him as sort of a sideline to what was happening in England. I more and more read on it, and one of the towering religious figures of that day was an Oxford divine and a chaplain to both Oliver Cromwell and the king's son who came back after Oliver Cromwell's death, named John Owen. He was the most popular preacher of his day. He was sort of like the Billy Graham of the era. And John Owen, on one occasion, went to hear John Bunyan preach. And the king heard about it. The king's son, he hated the Puritans. And he said to John Owen, he says, you're an educated man. He said, why would you go to listen to a tinker? What's the point? And John Owen said, Your Majesty, he said, I would give away all of my learning if I could move men like that tinker does. And actually it was John Owen that paid John Bunyan's fine and had him released from jail, and actually sent his book to the printer. So don't think of Bunyan quite as just this forgotten, singular little guy in the distance. He was a powerful figure in his day. And I've figured out the point of the power. Let me share this with you. It's not as long as the other reading. It's from the central point, I think, of Grace Abounding, explaining how he turned from a profane ex-soldier who was known for his potty mouth to someone that really got to the nitty-gritty of spiritual life. He says this, I fell into company with one poor man that had made profession of religion, who, as I thought, did talk pleasantly of the Scriptures and of the matters of religion. Wherefore, falling into some love and liking to what he said, I betook me to my Bible and began to take great pleasure in reading, but especially with the historical parts thereof. I've been there. It's possible to study the Bible and love the way that its language modulates, and to read the history of the kings. When I was book editor, we dealt with follow-ons from, I think it was Edwin Thiele wrote the numbers of the Hebrew kings. You could spend your whole life trying to divine the historical record of ancient Israel. It's not useless, but if that's where you're stuck, as John Bunyan said, you might be in the wrong place. He says, thus I continued for about a year, all of which time our neighbours did take me to be a very godly man, a new and religious man, and did marvel much to see such a great and famous alteration in my life and manners. And indeed so it was, though yet I knew not Christ, nor grace, nor faith, nor hope. For as I have well seen since, had I then died, my state had been most fearful. Yet I loved to be talked about as one that was truly godly. I was proud of my godliness, and indeed I did all that I did, either to be seen of or to be well spoken of by men. But upon a day, the good providence of God called me to Bedford. That's where he was in jail at one time too. It called me to Bedford to work on my calling. And in one of the streets of that town, I came where there were 3 or 4 poor women sitting at a door in the sun, talking about the things of God. And being now willing to hear them discourse, I drew near to hear what they said, for I was now a brisk talker also myself in the matters of religion. But I may say, I heard but understood not, for they were far above, out of my reach. Their talk was about a new birth, the work of God in their hearts, also how they were convinced of their miserable state by nature. They talked how God had visited their souls with his love in the Lord Jesus, and with what words and promises they had been refreshed, comforted, and supported against the temptations of the devil. And methought, they spake as if joy did make them speak. They spake with such pleasantness of scripture language, and with such appearance of grace in all that they said, that they were to me as if they had found a new world, as if they were people that dwelt alone and were not to be reckoned among their neighbours. At this I felt my own heart began to shake, and mistrust my condition to be naught. For I saw that in all my thoughts about religion and salvation, the new birth did never enter into my mind. Neither knew I the comfort of the word and promise, nor the deceitfulness and treachery of my own wicked heart. By these things, he said, my mind was now so turned that it lay like a horse leech. You know the leech? Those big things, I had them in Australia. They'll suck ounces of blood from you. So he says, by these things my mind was now so turned that it lay like a horse leech at the vein, crying, give, give, give. Yea, it was so fixed on eternity and on the things about the kingdom of heaven, that is, so far as I knew, though as yet God knows I knew but little, that neither pleasures, nor profits, nor persuasions, nor threats could loose it or make it let go its hold. That's the sort of dynamic of religion that is always needed, that used to exist, that is rare as hen's teeth today. It's as rare as horse leeches. And I am convinced that Adventism needs that thinking, or we will go down in the valley of despair. Yes, we live 7 years longer. Wonderful program. We need to have health fairs and all the rest. But that's not going to convert people. In fact, I was on committees where they found that when we promoted that too much, people hated us for it. It's sort of abundantly obvious in the real world. The Jewish community, for any number of reasons, both the residual blessing of God and their diligence and so on, they excel in many areas. Does that make people want to take on Judaism? Not at all. Of course, we say that you can have these benefits, but it's not usually a good approach. The good approach is to present Christ, not ourselves. And Adventism is stuck in that rut. We think that we are to be the model to the world. We're to present Christ. We're to present the hope of a soon coming Christ. Yes. We're to have that dynamic that even in a civil war such as John Bunyan lived through, and that we may see, if not a civil war in a classic sense, we will see a meltdown of society. In the middle of it, we need to be a godly people. Yes. A people as excited about these things as Christian was, enough to fight a figurative devil and a monster, and enough to battle the real realities of life that will crowd in on us and chase out spirituality. And as A.T. Jones has said, if you read his writings, when he got up in 1888, he said, if it's just a matter of being tough when the persecution comes, nobody can stand. But he says, if you are died to the things of this world, if your life is hid in Christ, nobody can touch you. That's the dynamic. I don't know about you. You know, I'm not a teenager anymore. When I was tough, I thought, younger and tougher, I thought that I could tough it out. I know now not. I mean, I've thought about it. You know, they put me in jail, I'll get a cold and pneumonia within a week. I physically couldn't endure any sort of major persecution in myself. But somehow we need to have that shift of mind that shifts us from these things of this world to another world. And I believe also that's infectious. It was with John Bunyan. I mean, the erudite preacher of the times could be flocking there to hear this tinker tell the king, I'd give it all away if I could understand it like he does. No secret, it was the biblical understanding. I'm sure last time I was here I shared a little bit from Charles Haddon Spurgeon. And I've got a couple of quotes and then I'll finish. I'm sure 12 o'clock is a marker here. And that'll be long enough anyway. But in one of his sermons, my glasses are really fading on me. One of his sermons, Spurgeon writing or speaking at the same time as our church began, he said this: a Christian is as essentially different from a worldling as a dove is from a raven, or a lamb from a lion. He is not of the world, even in his nature. You could not make him a worldling. You might do what you liked. You might cause him to fall into some temporary sin, but you could not make him a worldling. You might cause him to backslide, but you could not make him a sinner as he used to be. He is not of the world by his nature. He is a twice-born man. In his veins runs the blood of the royal family of the universe. He is a noble man. He is a heaven-born child. His freedom is not merely a bought one, but he hath his liberty, his newborn nature. He is essentially and entirely different from the world. And he says, "Oh no, if ye are God's people, then ye are not of the world in your nature. For ye are," quote, "not of the world, even as Christ was not of the world." You know, these are, I think, some things attitudes and relationships we should think on. And then in another sermon where he talks about Daniel in the lion's den, he said this. He says, "Many have declined to carry a light burden and have been constrained to bear a far heavier one. They have fled from the bear, and the lion has met them. They have sought to escape from the serpent, but the dragon has devoured them." And I'm trying to link it to Napoleon and the Battle of Christian. To shrink from duty is always perilous. To demoralize yourselves in demoralized times is a desperate alternative. Better go forward. Better go forward. I say, then even though you may have no armor, the safest thing is to go on. Even if there are lions in front, it is better to go ahead. For if you turn your back, the stars in their courses will fight against you. And then he says, and here's the conclusion on a religious liberty dynamic, he says, "Now it is a great privilege that we enjoy civil and religious liberty in our favoured land." He was talking about England. And you need to remember this dynamic. I've said it as often as I can. It's not that this is not a free country. I'm not questioning it. But we are in extraordinary times. And don't rely on what other people tell you to know whether or not you have freedom in a general sense or religious freedom in a particular sense. The boombox of a closed environment will always reinforce the popular view, which is not necessarily correct. I've been to enough countries, even some distinctly unfree ones, and within the country, unless people are a political dissident or directly suffering for their faith, they all say it's the freest country in the world. So don't judge by the echo chamber. Have a spiritual parameter to compare it against. And he says, now we live in this favoured land. That we are, he says, it is a great privilege that we live here, that we are not under such cruel laws as in other times and in other countries laid restrictions upon conscience, and that we may pray according to the conviction of our judgment and the desire of our heart. But as I want you to value the privilege very much, I will put a supposition to you, says Spurgeon. Suppose there was only one place in the world where a man might pray and offer his supplications unto God. Well, I think there's not a man among us that would not like to get there at some time or another. Oh, what pains we should take to reach the locality, and what pressure we would endure to enter the edifice. If there were only one house of prayer in all this world, and prayer could be heard nowhere else, what tugging and squeezing and toiling there would be to get into that one place. But now that people may pray anywhere, how they slight the exercise and neglect the privilege. We have religious freedom, and we defend Adventists that are under the burden of conscience in the workplace. But I can tell you, most of us are not burdened. Most of us are not burdened. And I've thought about this a lot lately. If we're not living a life that is pushing the parameters of the world, when the world then encroaches on us more and more and would try to restrict us as it always will, would we even notice it? Religious liberty, half of it is how you perceive the situation. If you're living a lackadaisical life, There's no persecution. The Bible says that. In Hebrews, where it talks about the faithful through the ages, and it says that not accepting release. There's release. It's called compromise. But if we are set for the kingdom, if as Seventh-day Adventists we are convinced that the Lord is soon to come, if we are convinced that our lives are to be lived a different way than the world lives, then we will act on it. If not, what good are we? What good is it to have an organization? Lots of time, lots of money. We've really got to examine this, and I believe it's the moment of truth for Adventism. We're not a happy club. It's not just to be a club. We can be as happy as we like, and human interaction is godly. But we are not called just to be a nice club of Seventh-day Adventists. We were called to be a reform movement, not to reinvent Christianity, but to reinvigorate it. And we are not, in spite of what some of our radicals, usually conservatives online, think, we are not extraordinary people. We have been given an extraordinary message. And I think now is the time for our church to come alive and do something. Yes, we'll have health classes and so on. It's wonderful. It's an entering wedge. But we better cut to the chase when the moment presents itself. Say that we are living and preparing for a future world. That conscience is everything, not compromise. That godliness is everything, not, a greyish area where we'll, live one way during the week and another in the pews. And I hope that each of us, as we face this real spiritual battle, will decide to arm ourselves effectively and to sally forth against whatever Apollyon or giant despair or whatever, the figurative battle with the world, the flesh, and the devil will bring to us, and recognize that beyond that is a shining city and welcoming shining ones who want us to be part of an eternal kingdom. That's a dream that should inspire each of us. It's a dream that formed our church. The more I read of these people, they were not well educated, many of them. They were well read. They were not wealthy, very many of them. But they had this hope, and they were willing to give up their livelihood. They were willing to put up with the mocking of their fellow Christians, ultimately to be ejected from their churches. But they were living for this blessed hope, the soon returning of the Lord Jesus Christ. God bless you each. Let's bow in the word of benediction. Dear Lord, we thank you that we can live in these times that are, of course, challenging, spiritually dangerous, but invigorating for the ultimate reason that we can see the signs of your soon return. And I pray that each of us will, of course, prepare ourselves spiritually for that. And like part 2 of Pilgrim's Progress, help us to make sure that our family and our friends also come along on that journey, because we know that you're not willing that any should be lost. And I pray that each of us will be part of a grand company soon on the sea of glass. Is my prayer for Jesus' sake. Amen. Amen.